Fantastic. Don't y'all all just look forward to being in heaven with Donnie and singing? I just didn't want to go this afternoon. Okay. Alan, come on up. All right. Y'all, we have a special speaker. It took our people weeks to negotiate this deal because the man is a lawyer. All right. Alan, born in Birmingham. He was a preacher's kid. Well, I guess he still is a preacher's kid, yes. Through middle school, he lived in Montgomery, then moved to Jacksonville, Florida, went to the University of North Florida, studied law school at the University of Alabama.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide, somebody said. Okay. Then he was fortunate enough to convince the beautiful and saintly Kristen Reed, now Kristen Reed Mathis. Would you hold your hand up, please, Kristen? Okay. To be his bride. They had produced two lovely daughters, Lily, 6, Ada, 3. Okay. Then he started a law practice, or started working in law, and now is with Butler Snow.
Correct.
Okay. Been here since 2003 at Homewood. Please help me. Wait, before that, you do realize that the young lady here could have had a phenomenal country music career because she was singing for a while with the High Heel Billies, or the real name of the group. Okay. And 2, since she's from Winfield, they were in the front wagon at Mule Day, which occurs, everything we say here is true, which occurred the 4th Saturday in September coming up. Please help me welcome a man who has taken time off from his book, Why Lawyers Are Really Nice Guys, because he's got writer's block. To be with us today, Alan Mathis.
Thank you. Excited to be with you. Let's go to the next slide. You've seen I'm very creative with the title of my lesson, Encouraging Words. I don't know how I came up with that. All right, as Russ said, my dad was a preacher. He used to be in a cappella quartet with the Druid Hills Church of Christ in the early 80s. This was their uniform, or the closest I could find on Google Images. Google was not around when their quartet was around. So nice burgundy blazer there with the slacks, the matching tie. And they'd go around, they'd sing at other churches, they'd sing at our Sunday night events, things like that. The lead singer of the group, he was chatty. He would talk too much. He'd get up and he'd just talk and talk and talk. And the other members of the group said, Jim, we love you, but we're here to sing, not talk. So if you just introduce us and then we'll get right to it. I said, okay, message received. I'll do that. They were invited to sing at what was basically a halfway house for mentally unstable people who'd been in an institution and were coming back out into the regular society to live on their own again. And Jim, true to his word, was going to keep it short. He said, this is Don, he's our bass. This is Mark, he's our tenor. David, our baritone, and I'm Jim. And we're just 4 Christian men who love to sing in front of anybody crazy enough to listen to us. So I'm pleased that today I've got an audience that's crazy enough to listen to me. I've got an updated picture, next slide. The picture here is great, but the girls have grown up just a little bit. Also wanted to give you warning so you can more easily spot Lily and Ada. If you see Lily coming, find a comfortable chair, because she's going to talk to you for a while. She loves to talk. As she told us, about a year ago, I love to talk and to be fancy. That's what she likes to do. And Ada, best to just give her a wide berth. She's like a tornado of blonde hair and chubby cheeks. Next slide. I had a little trouble coming up with what I was going to talk about today. Usually when I'm teaching a class, we've got a specific topic, and encouraging words is pretty broad. Anything as long as it's encouraging gave me a little bit too much rope, and I may hang myself today, but we'll see. So I started thinking, well, what was encouraging to me? What was a time where I needed encouragement, and somebody reached out to me, and it made a difference? And what topics are encouraging to me? Brett's lesson was really right on the money, too, when he said sadness and anger often reveals something deeper is wrong. That goes right to what I'm going to talk about today. In 2013, my law firm at the time, not the one I'm with now, we started going through some troubles. Just all of a sudden, things had been rosy. I made partner in 2010, thought everything was good. I'm on the path that my plan is working out exactly the way I wanted it to. And then come 2013, we started having meetings. Money situations a little bit shaky at times, and we weren't sure what was going to happen. There's lots of discord, lots of uncertainty, and the way things worked out, it at least seemed to me that the people who were doing things the right way were the ones that bad things were starting to happen to, and the people that weren't doing things the way they were supposed to be doing it were being somehow rewarded for this. This made me very frustrated, very angry, very bitter. I wasn't a very happy camper at the time. And ultimately, this firm, which had been around in Birmingham for nearly 90 years, we did dissolve. So it was a very stressful time. I didn't know what I was going to do. I started to have crisis of career and faith, and I'm the head of my household. What am I going to be doing in a few months if this firm goes away? And I didn't know that. So I was in a funk, and my question was, what is my purpose? Am I supposed to be a lawyer? My dad was a preacher. Should I have been a preacher? Should I go be a park ranger? Should I go live off the land? Everything was occurring to me. Let's open up a coffee shop. Nobody steal this idea, but Krista and I have often talked about a coffee shop. We live in Bluff Park, and we will call it Bluff Perk. So, but don't steal that. Don't steal that. And sorry, I see that on these slides, the writing, it looked a lot bigger on my screen at home, but I'll read it to you. I got into Ecclesiastes, which is a great book, one of my favorites, but if you read it in the wrong mind frame, it's not necessarily going to cheer you up. And I could see eye to eye with a lot of the darker passages of Ecclesiastes at that time. Ecclesiastes 2:17, so I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me. For all is vanity and a striving after the wind. Next slide. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. And then next slide. There's a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people, and I was thinking of myself as I read this passage, to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity. So I was thinking to myself, I must have some other purpose. I've laid out this plan, and now it's starting to crumble. What is supposed to happen to me? Does any of it even matter? Is it all just chance? Does God have a plan for me? And if it is, I don't seem to know what it is. So destiny versus chance. I read these verses, Romans 8:29 and 30. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. Well, this sounds like it should be good, but I didn't really understand what it meant. I was looking for answers. Is this the destiny that God has planned for me? Why are things starting to go wrong? Or is God detached? Does he not care what happens to me day to day, and I'm just floating along on a breeze without anchor to anything? Another similar verse, in him we've obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will, so that we who were the first to hope in Christ might be to the praise of his glory. Again, I was questioning this, why is it his will that I should be in this situation? Around the same time, other things were happening, not just my law firm, but Krista and I, this is smaller, but it was a frustration on top of the pile of frustrations at the time. We had our 10th anniversary trip scheduled. We were going to Miami Beach. We had a nice hotel room with a balcony. We were going to really do it up for 10th anniversary. And we both got the flu 2 days before we were supposed to go. Still had a temperature over 102 degrees the day we were supposed to leave, and we had to cancel. And of course, since we canceled last minute, we still had to pay for most of the trip. So this didn't help my mood at the time. Even worse, her brother got the flu, and some of y'all will remember this when I say it. He got the flu, and somehow it turned into MRSA staph on his lungs. He's in his early 30s. He's in the hospital on death's doorstep, basically, for 6 weeks or more. And he's fine now and just had his first baby, so praise God, he's healed him. But we're going through a lot, and I'm not understanding where God is in all this. But luckily, this light bulb, the light bulb came on when one of my partners that I was talking to and venting to, he was my assigned mentor throughout my career at the first law firm I was at. And he heard me, and I even revealed my crisis of faith. You know, I don't even know how to talk to God right now, I told him. And he said, well, I want you to look at Romans 8:26. And it says, likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. For we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And this was a turning point for me, that I don't have to know what to say to God. Somebody else can do that for me. All I got to do is open up the line of communication and see what's in store. And I did that. And I don't even think I've told Kristen this before. I was running on the treadmill shortly after that, thinking about all the stressors in my life, and thought about this passage, tried to just open up communication and let the Spirit intercede, and just cried like a baby. All the burden was very heavy, and just I let it go and opened up. And I don't know exactly what the Spirit told God, but it worked. Because I felt so much better, and started to realize I'm just focused on what's going on in my life. I'm not focused on God's plan. God's plan isn't that I get to be a successful lawyer in Birmingham and have a nice house and have nice things. That's not what his concern is. But it was my concern, and that's why I was having a struggle. And so I got to the point where, and I don't know if this video will work, but this next slide, the incomparable wisdom of Forrest Gump, I think sums it up, if it plays, but it won't. So I'll do my best to set up the clip I was going to show you. So Jenny has just died, and Forrest, has everybody seen Forrest Gump? I assume. I can't believe it's 22 years since that movie came out. Sorry, that's not an encouraging word, I guess, now that I throw it out there. So Jenny has died, and Forrest is visiting her gravesite. And he says, Jenny, I don't know if Mama's right or if it's Lieutenant Dan, if we all have a destiny, or if we're all just floating around on a breeze accidental-like. But I think maybe it's both. Maybe both is happening at the same time. I think that's exactly right. Oh, thank you. Yeah. As an aside, in college, I was a waiter at a yacht club in Jacksonville. And unfortunately, I became known, it was much better then. You saw a rusty version of Forrest Gump. I was known as having a Forrest Gump impression. And some of my regulars, after they had had too much to drink, to be honest, would call me over and make me do a Forrest Gump impression for their friends. But they gave good tips, so what are you going to do? So yeah, I think both is happening at the same time. We're going to live our lives, and things are going to happen to us, and sometimes we're going to feel like we're floating out on a breeze, accidental-like. But God does have a plan for us. He knows where we're going, and if we trust in him, we know where we're going. We don't know exactly what the path is going to be to get there, but we know where we're going, and we can have confidence in that through the bad times. We know that God has a plan. The next slide that was up there is a book called The Story. Max Lucado and Randy Frazee went in together and wrote this. It's basically just scripture, but it's the Bible, an abridged version of the Bible put into 31 chapters. Nothing added to the stories, really, a little bit of commentary. We studied this book in our young families class some last year. And what struck me about the story, and we'll go to the next slide, they talk about the upper story and the lower story, and what they do so well throughout these 31 chapters is they weave all of the stories of the Bible together to show you, to reveal God's one upper story. From the very beginning with Adam and Eve to the very end of Revelation and victory, weaving all of those stories together. Because so often we look at individual stories. We look at Moses, we look at Noah, we look at Adam and Eve, but we look at them all individually, and we don't think, especially with the Old Testament stories, how they fit in with everything else. But the good news of the story and the upper story of God, what's going on behind the surface, behind the scenes, is that we're part of that too. So our lower story, the way we live day to day, is woven into God's upper story just the same way as all these stories in the Bible. So the interconnection, even the genealogies, I have a confession. Confession is good for the soul, right? And I think if you're honest, you'll confess this too. When I'm trying to implement an annual Bible reading plan, when you get to the genealogies, isn't that a catch-up day? It's like, well, I'm a few chapters behind. I can skip over all these. It's just a list of names. But in viewing it this way, upper story and lower story, all those people, we don't know what their lower stories were, but they're connected to the heroes of the Bible. If not for them and their lives, these people wouldn't have existed. Even if that's the only role they played in the upper story that we know about, it's an important role. I mean, if David were never born, if Jesus were never born. So these genealogies took on a new meaning for me too, and that gave me hope. We may not know how our lower story is connected to the upper story, but we can have confidence that it is connected. God's going to use us in his upper story. And so the encouraging words we have here so far is God has a plan. Nothing can disrupt it. We all have a part to play. And evil can make people and events change course along the way, make us float along on the breeze a little bit. But all things bend to the will of God and ultimately work for the glory and fulfillment of God's upper story. This was an encouragement to me at the time, and a continuation of the encouragement that started with just opening up and trying to connect to God and God's upper story. And so we know God has plans for us. The next slide, Jeremiah 29:11, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for wholeness and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." And the next slide, Romans 8:28, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." The next slide. Now, this doesn't mean that just because we're connected to the upper story, that our lower story here on earth is always going to be rosy. We may not like what's happening to us, but we can still be confident that it fits into God's plan, that we're serving his purpose. This picture of the cross, what do you think when you see the cross? What comes to mind when you see the cross?
Death of Christ.
Mm-hmm. And what's the result of the death of Christ? What is the result of the death of Christ? That's right. Salvation, hope. A torture device by the Romans takes on, and it is a universal symbol of hope and salvation. It's because that's where it fits in God's upper story. In the lower story, it's just a torture device. The connection between the lower story and the upper story with Jesus is right there for us. The upper story is glorious. The lower story is tragic. Jesus' story shows us, as much as anything, that just because you're in harmony with God's upper story does not mean that you'll face life's trials without fear or difficulty. Jesus himself, in the next slide, in John 12:27, "Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name." So Jesus understands the upper story. He understands that his own lower story on earth is secondary, and he is completely accepting and understands his place in the upper story. And as a result, his darkest hour led to our brightest. It's hard to model a perfect understanding of God's upper story. It's easy to get caught up in what happens to us day to day, and that's going to happen, and that's okay. It's just part of the journey. But we have, next bullet point in the next slide, we have an opportunity to connect to God's upper story now through Jesus Christ. But are we focused on the upper story, or are we focused on the lower story? What's happening to us? What's happening to my law firm? What am I going to do? How am I going to provide for my family? Or do we trust in God that if we're fully connected with him, we're on the path he wants us to be on? Will we choose to be in harmony or discord with God's upper story? The next slide. More confession. I'm a geek. Many of you know this already. And some of you who've been in my class before will have heard this imagery, but I really like this. Is anybody Lord of the Rings fan in here? Lord of the Rings, seen the movies, read the books? The Silmarillion is another book by J.R.R. Tolkien. It's before the Lord of the Rings. It's kind of dense. I actually have never read it. I listened to it in the car. I was driving a lot a few years ago, and so I thought, well, this is about a 36-hour book, so I'll listen to it while I drive all around. He tells a creation story in his made-up universe, but I thought the imagery was great, especially for our purpose. And that is, God's will be done no matter what. And the more Satan tries to disrupt it, he can't disrupt it. The more beautiful he makes God's story. So the creation story, and stick with me, it's a little dense. If you don't understand, raise your hand and I'll call you out. It tells how God, of his story, creates lesser spiritual beings, be they angels or whatever, and he teaches them how to sing, a musical theme. He gives them all parts to sing. And when they sing, it harmonizes, and it's beautiful. Well, the most powerful of the lesser spiritual beings, the equivalent of Satan, decides, you know what? I've got my own thoughts. I've got my own music in me. I don't want to sing what God gave me. I want to sing my own theme. And he tries to create discord in the music. But every time he creates that discord, a new musical theme comes and drowns it out and blends with his discord. And then God reveals to all these spiritual beings that the musical themes he had them sing were actually singing the world, Middle Earth in this book, into existence. And that the discord, that Melkor is his name, that the Satan character thought he was creating, only caused the world to increase in beauty. It made higher mountains. It made deeper valleys. It made swifter rivers. And the language he uses is very kind of King James-esque. And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined. I just always love that imagery. Satan can't. As soon as he thinks he's got God licked, Jesus is dead on the cross. It's the exact opposite. It's the greatest triumph. So, harmony or discord? Discord with God makes our lower story more painful and difficult, but it doesn't change the result of God's upper story. It only prevents us from participating in the joys of God's story. Next slide. So in this, there's good news and there's bad news. Ada, our 3-year-old, almost 4, she'd like me to tell you that. She'll be 4 later this month, so 3 is misleading. She came up not long ago. We were in the kitchen. Mommy, Daddy, I've got good news and I've got bad news. It's like, okay, what do you want to tell us first? Well, the bad news. Jersey, our dog, peed on the floor. It's like, well, what's the good news? There is no good news. She's done it the other way, too. Good news, bad news. What do you want to tell me? The good news. I got a great report at gymnastics camp. Well, great. What's the bad news? There is no bad news. She just likes the phrase, but it's a lot of fun. So I've got a little bad news. Not necessarily bad news, but it's something, it can be a little scary. Unless you're paying attention and trying to stay connected to God's upper story, it's really easy to get completely absorbed in your own lower story, what's happening to you on a daily basis, just like I was a few years ago with my work situation. And once you've disconnected, you may not even realize you're going down the wrong path. And if you go down that path too long, you're still going to be used in God's upper story, but it may not be in the way you intend. Think about throughout the Bible, the people whose hearts were hardened, like Pharaoh. And the Bible says he was lifted up for God's purpose. Think about Caiaphas. He prophesied that Jesus would die to save the Jews. Well, he was correct, but he had something very different in mind because he was focused on the lower story. Judas, also, Satan entered him, and Judas was definitely used to fulfill God's upper story, but certainly not in the way that Judas intended. The rich young ruler that Brett talked about earlier is a good example. He's lower story focused, at least at the time, not upper story focused. And so it's easy to fall into that trap. So how do we stay in tune with the upper story? The next slide. Proverbs 3:6, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make straight your paths. Well,